What if I told you Prince Harry just shattered the last thread holding him to the monarchy, and King Charles responded by officially erasing him from the royal family? In a move that insiders are calling both devastating and unprecedented, Prince Harry has allegedly filed sealed court documents questioning whether King Charles is even his real father. The result? A royal decree so severe it stripped Harry of all ties to succession, ceremony, and centuries of legacy. Tonight, we uncover the secret filing that reignited the James Hewitt scandal, the emotional collapse inside Windsor's walls, and the brutal decision that left Harry disowned and Meghan silenced. Stay with us. This isn't just a family feud. It's the moment the House of Windsor was torn in two. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The rain hadn't yet started falling over London that morning, but the sky had turned a somber gray, more the color of regret than routine British weather. Inside the guarded walls of Clarence House, silence reigned. Not the comforting kind that comes with stillness, but the kind that creeps up behind your back and whispers that something irreversible is about to unfold. Every hallway felt heavier. Every step from palace staff echoed like a warning. And inside the king's private study, His Majesty Charles III sat with a sealed manila folder in front of him, hands trembling slightly, his signet ring glinting under the antique desk lamp. He hadn't yet opened it, but he already knew what it contained. He had been warned. The folder was marked Private, Litigation Disclosure, Sussex Inquiry. It wasn't the official label that unsettled him. It was the subtext. What he was about to read would split open wounds never fully healed, expose a fracture in the royal family that might never be mended. And worst of all, it had been delivered to him not by his enemies, not by the press, not by Republicans or political foes, but by his own son. The son he once cradled in St. Mary's Hospital. The boy he had taken on his shoulders through Kensington Gardens. The young man he had walked behind, grief-stricken, at Diana's funeral. Prince Harry, his youngest child, had formally, legally, and very publicly questioned whether Charles was his real biological father. For those paying attention, the signs had been growing louder over the past few years. Since the Sussexes' departure from royal duties, whispers turned to headlines, and headlines to televised tell-alls. But this wasn't a Netflix monologue. This wasn't a podcast jab. This was a court document, filed through legal channels, meant to influence inheritance discussions, future trust disbursements, and royal lineage records. For a monarch, there are few betrayals more cutting than being accused of not being what the crown defines you to be. The father of a future king, or in this case, of a once-favored prince. This is not just a family drama. This is an earthquake beneath the British monarchy. In this video, we're going to unravel the events that led up to the moment King Charles allegedly disowned Prince Harry in a sealed royal decree. We'll look into the legal documents that triggered the fallout, revisit the decades-old rumors about Harry's paternity, and expose the chilling detail that allegedly pushed Charles to make a horrifying decision, one that effectively erases Harry from the royal future. Make no mistake, this isn't tabloid fluff. This is a constitutional crisis disguised as a family matter. So, what really happened? How could Harry have crossed such a forbidden line? And was Meghan Markle truly the mastermind behind a legal betrayal? You're about to find out. Let's start by going back just a few weeks prior to the sealed court filing. Before the storm broke, when Harry and Meghan were still planning their next media move from Montecito, California, the couple had been increasingly frustrated with their inability to access royal inheritance provisions. Though King Charles had maintained a public posture of financial severance since their exit from official duties, legal experts say there remained complex trust structures and entitlements set up under the Queen's original estate that Harry was still eligible to benefit from. Those funds, in theory, could sustain the Sussexes' lifestyle without reliance on external deals. But as new audits of the Duchy of Cornwall and other royal assets began to surface in the House of Lords' private oversight committees, one thing became alarmingly clear. The money trail that Harry believed was rightfully his was either frozen, reallocated, or in limbo. According to insiders familiar with the situation, Harry's lawyers began discreetly preparing a legal strategy. Not to sue outright, but to clarify his standing in these royal trusts. And in doing so, they submitted a request for genealogical verification of lineal descent in relation to disputed financial entitlements. Put plainly, Harry asked the court for permission to verify whether he was the biological son of King Charles. The request may have been phrased diplomatically, but its implications were brutal. In any other family, a paternity request could destroy dinner-table relationships. In the royal family, it's a nuclear detonation. Within the palace, panic broke out. The Queen's former staffers, many of whom had served Charles since the 1970s, were in disbelief. Charles's private secretary reportedly advised him to go public immediately and deny the allegations. But Charles refused. His instinct wasn't strategic, it was emotional. He was hurt. Deeply. Sources close to the king say that in those early days after learning of the court filing, Charles became almost reclusive. He canceled meetings. He delayed ceremonial briefings. One insider described it best. It was like watching a man who just found out his whole life was up for renegotiation. Because this wasn't about DNA. Not really. This was about trust. It was about loyalty. It was about his son publicly suggesting that the man who raised him was, biologically, a fraud. The British press began picking up on the tension within days. Phrases like inheritance ambiguity and internal royal review began popping up in newspaper columns, even though few people outside the legal teams knew the details. Online forums reignited with the old conspiracy theory that James Hewitt, Princess Diana's former riding instructor and known lover, was Harry's real father. That rumor, long considered a myth by royal historians, had always lingered at the margins of Harry's life. Now, with the court request surfacing behind sealed doors, it suddenly had legal teeth. What pushed Harry to make such a shocking move? Was it desperation for funds, or something deeper, a lifelong ache for the truth? In Montecito, Meghan's involvement was widely speculated. Her critics pointed to her history of challenging royal norms and leveraging media pressure. Some insiders alleged that Meghan had long encouraged Harry to explore the Hewitt theory, framing it as an act of liberation rather than betrayal. A few claimed that she referred to Charles not as your father, but as the king, even in private settings. Whether she orchestrated the legal filing or merely supported it, the damage was done. The palace had received formal notice that Prince Harry wanted the crown to prove that the blood that runs in his veins is, in fact, royal. And just as shocking as the request was the response. After weeks of deliberation, King Charles made what insiders now describe as the hardest decision of his reign. In a private decree sealed, but confirmed by multiple palace sources, he officially stripped Harry of all future ceremonial duties, removed him from the royal succession planning, and, according to one source, instructed the Crown Estate's legal department to regard Harry as a non-beneficiary from this day forward. In plainer terms, King Charles disowned his son, not just in emotion, but in legacy. That decree, though not made public, is rumored to have been delivered to Harry's lawyers through diplomatic channels via the British consulate in Los Angeles. When Harry received the document, he reportedly screamed. Witnesses from his security team say they heard glass shattering in the Sussex estate shortly after the envelope was opened. Neighbors reported loud arguments that evening. One unnamed former aide said, "It sounded like the collapse of a man who had just realized he cut his only lifeline. And this was just the beginning. The monarchy's future is now in flux. The public is split. William, Catherine, and their children are seen as the royal family's last stronghold of continuity. But even their positions feel more fragile than ever. If a son can question his father's bloodline, and the king responds by erasing that son, what message does that send to the world? Is this the final fracture in a family that was already bleeding from within? Is Harry now beyond redemption? And what happens when royalty becomes personal? In the chapters to follow, we'll examine these questions in devastating detail. We'll expose the documents, the advisors, the meetings behind locked doors, and the final whispers of a family that is no longer a family, but a battlefield. And it all began with one question. Am I really your son? The first sign that something serious had shifted came not from Buckingham Palace or any public relations agency, but from a quiet legal clerk inside the Royal Courts of Justice. This individual, unnamed due to confidentiality agreements, reportedly noticed a highly restricted file being registered under emergency seal, referencing the Sussex estate, the Crown's private legal counsel, and an obscure clause within the Inheritance Tax Act of 1984. That clause, designed to preserve hereditary wealth and reduce public burden on royal inheritance, had not been invoked in decades. And yet, here it was, back in play, tied to the most controversial figure in the monarchy, Prince Harry. This was not a routine filing. This was not a simple estate claim. This was the beginning of a legal battle that questioned not just entitlement, but identity. For weeks, very few people knew the truth about the nature of the documents submitted to the High Court. They were sealed under royal privilege, an extraordinary protection that limits access to sensitive legal disputes involving the sovereign and their immediate heirs. But within days, whispers began to leak. A legal assistant close to the royal barrister reportedly let slip during a private dinner that the filing included a request that would rock the family tree. Those words alone sent shockwaves through the inner circles of royal journalism. Theories circulated wildly. Was Harry attempting to access his mother's untouched inheritance? Was he requesting emergency protection orders for his children? Was there a motion to regain his military titles? None of those explanations came close to the truth. The actual document was structured in legal language, devoid of emotion but devastating in intent. Its core paragraph, leaked weeks later by an investigative reporter with ties to the legal community, read as follows. In light of recent advisory correspondence regarding disputed beneficiary status, the petitioner, Henry Charles Albert David, respectfully requests independent confirmation of lineal biological relationship to the respondent, His Majesty Charles Philip Arthur George, King of the United Kingdom and head of the Commonwealth. In simpler terms, Harry wanted proof, scientific, legal proof, that Charles was his father. Not since the days of Henry VIII had a matter of royal paternity been considered so publicly. It cut into the foundation of monarchy itself, the sanctity of blood, the unbroken chain of divine and noble lineage. In Britain, the crown does not merely pass down through love or ceremony. It is passed through blood, and to question that is to question the crown's legitimacy. The document had been filed quietly, and yet its contents screamed with historical violence. One line in particular, later quoted in investigative coverage by British and American outlets alike, sent royal historians into a panic. This request seeks only personal legal clarity and does not imply direct accusation. But for the crown, implication wasn't necessary. The damage was already done. Inside the palace, legal advisors immediately flagged the filing as a constitutional threat. A memo from the Lord Chamberlain's office called the filing potentially destabilizing to the institution if made public. The Queen's former private secretary, though now retired, was consulted in an emergency capacity and allegedly responded with a single, chilling sentence, "It's a challenge to the blood, and to the blood, there can be no challenge." This wasn't just about Harry. This was about what happened if Harry wasn't Charles's son. What happened to succession, to property, to decades of image management? And more urgently, what happened if the public believed it was true? But beyond legal panic, there was a more personal rupture forming. Charles, though briefed carefully and with caution, reportedly demanded to see the original court document within the hour of being informed. When it arrived, he read it in silence. He reportedly did not speak for several minutes. He placed the document on his desk, stood up, and walked out into the palace garden alone. When he returned, his aides say he looked physically aged, as though years had passed in minutes. It was as if he had died a little, said one member of his staff who witnessed the aftermath. The question now arose, why did Harry file the request in the first place? According to those close to the Sussex legal team, the issue stemmed from delays in the distribution of funds linked to a sovereign grant program tied to Queen Elizabeth II's estate. Though Harry had publicly renounced certain royal privileges after stepping down as a working royal, he remained a beneficiary in several trusts established during his youth, many of which were structured to mature when he turned 40. That milestone was fast approaching. But instead of seeing funds transferred, Harry's legal advisors reportedly received notices of delay, pending trustee clarification. Some insiders say this triggered Harry's suspicion. Why the delays? Why now? Who were the trustees suddenly questioning his status? It's unclear whether these delays were financial strategy or palace politics. But what is clear is that Harry viewed them as more than procedural. He saw them as a message, a warning, or perhaps worse, a threat. And so, he responded with a challenge of his own. Prove that he was Charles's son. To most observers, this seems like overkill. But Harry's defenders argue that his mental and emotional state had been eroding for years under the pressure of royal estrangement, public mockery, and unresolved trauma from his mother's death. Multiple sources have said that Harry had long harbored doubts, not necessarily about his identity, but about the integrity of those around him. Harry was always the outsider, said one former palace bodyguard who worked during the 1990s. Even as a teenager, he'd say things like, "I'm not like them." I don't think he meant it literally back then, But when you feel excluded for years, your mind starts going dark places. And perhaps that darkness finally took shape in the form of a court filing. For Meghan, the issue was reportedly more tactical than emotional. Those who've observed her legal dealings say she viewed the royal financial web as a system designed to entangle and starve those who left. Her perspective, they claim, was pragmatic. If the system can stall inheritance, then the only way to gain leverage is to challenge the system at its core. That challenge came in the form of DNA. While there's no public statement from Meghan on the issue, internal documents later obtained by investigative reporters show that the law firm retained by Harry and Meghan specializes in high-net-worth trust disputes, and more importantly, has handled cases involving genealogical evidence in the past. That was no coincidence. And still, the strategy backfired spectacularly. Instead of spurring the palace to respond with negotiation or settlement, the court filing ignited a fury. King Charles, blindsided and emotionally gutted, began convening with his most trusted advisors to determine how to respond, not as a father, but as a monarch. The difference, in that moment, mattered greatly. According to 3 separate palace insiders, Charles was torn. One part of him wanted to pick up the phone and scream. Another part wanted to walk away, to disown Harry in silence and never speak his name again. But the part that ultimately made the decision, the part trained from birth in statecraft and lineage and order, knew that the response had to be surgical, final, institutional. Charles ordered a review of all documents in which Harry's name appeared as a beneficiary, future trustee, or ceremonial title holder. He summoned constitutional lawyers and private estate administrators to Windsor under cover of night. Over a 3-day stretch, the king barely slept, conducting what one insider called a legal purge. And then, after reviewing every clause, every inheritance note, and every royal decree from the last 20 years, he gave the order, remove him. The legal team drafted a private royal decree, never meant for public release, but confirmed by multiple sources to exist. It stated that Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, would no longer be entitled to benefits, trusts, or ceremonial duties historically granted to members of the royal family. He would retain his blood title, because it could not be erased, but his rights would be frozen indefinitely. The sealed court filing had done its work. It had not only shattered a family, it had redrawn the boundaries of Britain's most ancient institution. Back in California, Harry reportedly awaited a response. When it came, his team was shocked. There was no countermotion, no acknowledgement of the DNA request, only a formal notice that his inheritance had been voided, and his standing as a royal beneficiary was no longer recognized. To this day, the exact DNA request has not been answered. Charles never allowed it to be fulfilled. In effect, he refused to dignify it. But by acting swiftly and severely, he gave his answer all the same. This section of the story reveals the true heart of the scandal. That beneath the gowns, crowns, and royal processions lies a question so raw, so ancient, and so dangerous, it could undo not just a man, but a monarchy. And that question was written in ink, filed in court, and delivered to a king. Prove to me you're my father. It was the kind of rumor that never really died, only lay dormant, waiting for the right scandal to breathe life back into it. For decades, whispers about Prince Harry's paternity had lingered at the edges of public consciousness, dismissed by most as tasteless speculation fueled by tabloid culture. But the moment Harry's court filing emerged, quietly, legally, but powerfully, the flame roared back to life. The name James Hewitt exploded once again across headlines, podcasts, forums, and every imaginable corner of the internet. A story that had hovered like an ugly shadow over Harry's upbringing was now at the forefront of a royal crisis. To understand how deep this wound goes, one must rewind the clock, not just to Harry's birth in 1984, but to the years leading up to it. Diana, Princess of Wales, was a woman trapped in an emotionally frigid marriage, surrounded by palace expectations, and suffocating beneath public adoration that often misunderstood her torment. Charles, even as heir to the throne, had never given her the warmth she craved. Their marriage was strained from the outset, a union orchestrated more by royal convenience than shared affection. During these years of personal anguish, Diana sought comfort wherever she could find it. One of those places was with a former household cavalry officer named James Hewitt. Their affair began in 1986, well documented through Diana's own words and secret recordings later used by biographer Andrew Morton. In these tapes, she admitted to falling in love with Hewitt, even going so far as to say, "Yes, I adored him. Yes, I was in love with him, but I was very let down. It was this confession that became the seed of a controversy. Although the timeline of their romantic involvement began after Harry's birth, conspiracy theorists were quick to exploit the resemblance. They pointed to the copper-red hair, a rarity in the royal bloodline, and Harry's more rugged features compared to the refined symmetry of his brother, William. Side-by-side photos of Harry and Hewitt flooded the media, with captions like, "Too close for coincidence," or, "Is this the real father?" Both Diana and Hewitt consistently maintained that their relationship began well after Harry's birth in September 1984. Hewitt himself, despite being cornered repeatedly by the press, insisted that he couldn't possibly be the father. In one interview, he stated firmly, "There really is no possibility whatsoever that I am Harry's father. I can absolutely assure you I'm not." But in the eyes of many, the denial wasn't enough. The idea had already taken root, and over time, it metastasized into something more sinister, a theory that Harry was illegitimate, unworthy, or even a living embarrassment to the monarchy. For Harry, the rumors were not just cruel, they were corrosive. As a child, he was shielded from them. But by the time he was a teenager, he could not escape the murmurs. Boarding school classmates made jokes. Tabloids ran stories under the guise of royal curiosity. By his 20s, he was reportedly obsessed with shutting them down. According to a former palace aide, Harry once asked his father directly, "Why do they keep saying I'm not yours?" To which Charles allegedly replied, "Because they have nothing better to write about." It may have been a deflection, or perhaps an attempt to preserve dignity. But for a young man growing up in the crosshairs of global fame, it wasn't enough. The question lingered, festering quietly. Fast forward to the modern day, and the court filing has revived that old doubt with unprecedented seriousness. This time, it's not an internet forum or a drunken whisper at a pub. It's an official legal motion, addressed to a king, filed by his own son. And it reopens the door to every headline, every cruel joke, and every conspiracy theory that ever haunted Prince Harry. The internet responded with ruthless speed. Reddit threads that had lain inactive for years began gaining traction overnight. Hashtags like #HewittTheory and #RoyalDNA trended globally. Photos comparing Harry and Hewitt surged once more across social media feeds. Some users even used AI tools to simulate what a Harry-Hewitt DNA match might imply visually, an eerie blend of speculative science and tabloid sensationalism. But it wasn't just amateurs stoking the flames. Prominent commentators weighed in. Piers Morgan, known for his antagonism toward the Sussexes, used his television platform to throw fuel on the fire, declaring, "Maybe Harry should have considered this rumor a bit more seriously before throwing legal daggers at his own father." The irony is suffocating. Meanwhile, other voices, particularly from American talk shows and liberal outlets, defended Harry's right to seek clarity. One panelist on a popular U.S. morning show asked, "If you had your entire life shaped by an institution, wouldn't you want to know the truth about who you really are?" Royal experts were less generous. Historian Hugo Vickers called the court filing an act of grave disrespect. He argued that even if doubts had lingered, Harry had crossed an unforgivable line by putting them into formal legal language. There are things one simply does not ask of a sovereign. To demand paternity proof is not just a betrayal of family, it's a betrayal of crown and country. The reaction from within the royal institution was equally blistering. While no official palace statement addressed the Hewitt theory, sources close to Prince William reportedly told the Times that he was livid over the re-emergence of the scandal. One insider said, "William spent half his childhood protecting his brother from these whispers. To see Harry himself feed that fire, it's unbearable." The personal consequences for Harry were also swift and severe. Long-standing supporters began to distance themselves. Certain British charities with royal affiliations allegedly postponed planned appearances with the Duke of Sussex. Even among celebrity friends, there was a noted cooling. According to sources in the Montecito social circle, invitations to elite private events began to dwindle. In a world obsessed with optics and legacy, aligning too closely with a man questioning his own royal blood became a reputational risk. Still, some say Harry may have expected this. In their view, he had reached a point where legacy no longer mattered, where truth, even painful or destructive truth, outweighed titles and ceremonies. Whether he believed in the Hewitt theory or not, filing that court document may have been his way of reclaiming his story after years of silence. There is also the theory, held by some psychological experts, that Harry's court motion was less about actual DNA and more about symbolic trauma. Dr. Lennox Graham, a clinical psychologist who has followed the royal family's mental health journey in public statements, speculated in a podcast interview that Harry's move was a subconscious projection of abandonment. When someone grows up feeling different, emotionally disconnected, and publicly speculated about, their sense of self becomes fragmented. Questioning one's paternity in such a high-profile way might be less about finding a new father and more about expressing a deep, unresolved identity crisis. It's a compelling theory, and one that resonates with many of Harry's own words over the years. In interviews, memoirs, and speeches, he's often described himself as an outsider, as someone who never truly fit in. In Spare, his best-selling memoir, he recounts numerous instances of being the family's black sheep, of being misunderstood and marginalized. At one point, he writes, "There were days I felt more like an extra in someone else's play than a character in my own life." If those words were a cry for recognition, then the court filing was the scream that followed. But lost in the media circus, the legal rhetoric, and the speculation is a more somber question. What would Princess Diana have thought of all this? Would she have defended Harry's right to know? Would she have condemned the move as unnecessary pain inflicted on Charles? Or would she have seen it as the final unraveling of a family she once tried so desperately to protect from itself? James Hewitt, for his part, has remained silent in recent years. Older now, out of the spotlight, he lives a quiet life far removed from the royal arena. In his last major interview nearly a decade ago, he said simply, "It's all so far behind me now." But in the last few days, photographers have once again appeared near his home. Journalists have renewed their request for comment. And somewhere in the halls of memory, the ghost of a scandal long buried has been resurrected. The most haunting part? It may not be the rumors. It may not even be the resemblance. It's the silence. The fact that no DNA test has ever been made public. That no definitive statement has ended the speculation. And now that a court filing has reignited it all, the silence feels heavier than ever, like a weight the monarchy cannot shed. In the end, it doesn't matter whether James Hewitt is Harry's father or not. What matters is that Harry asked. What matters is that Charles heard. What matters is that the world now sees a royal family unmasked, not just by cameras or critics, but by its own wounded heir. And what comes next may not be determined by facts or science or even justice, but by who the public believes. Because in the court of public opinion, perception is power. And once a crack is visible in the royal portrait, no amount of golden frame can hold it together. The bloodline has been questioned. The rumor has become real. And the ghost of James Hewitt, whether grounded in truth or myth, is now seated at the royal table, uninvited, but impossible to ignore. The weight of the crown is not always gold and jewels. Sometimes, it's silence, pain, and isolation. When King Charles first read the legal documents submitted by his son, documents that sought to verify, or rather, to challenge, the foundation of their blood tie, he didn't respond with anger, nor with protocol. He responded as a man, not as a monarch, not as a head of state. Just as a father who, for the first time in his life, was no longer sure his child believed in him at all. Those around Charles say the effect was immediate and deeply visible. His posture changed. His face, typically stoic in times of crisis, became unreadable. He dismissed everyone from the room except for his private secretary and requested no further meetings for the day. For a man whose schedule is packed to the minute, such a cancellation wasn't just rare, it was unprecedented. His aides, though trained to say nothing, exchanged uneasy glances. One described it as the only time in 10 years of service that they saw the king close the doors to his study and not come out until well past midnight. Inside those walls, Charles reportedly did not pace or dictate or call his advisors. He sat in his chair and stared at a photograph. It was a portrait of Harry, aged 6, standing beside Charles at a polo match. The boy was looking up at his father with a broad smile, arms behind his back. The photograph had once been in his bedroom, then moved to a hallway table, and eventually found its way to a drawer. Yet, for some reason, Charles had taken it out days before the filing arrived, as though, on some level, he knew a storm was coming. For hours, he looked at that picture. And in that picture, he saw more than just a son. He saw years of effort, of anguish, of love strained by duty. He saw himself pushing a swing in the Kensington Palace garden, teaching Harry to ride a horse, whispering calming words to him after Diana died. He saw a father who tried, imperfectly, perhaps, but genuinely. And now that boy had put it all into question with a single legal document. It wasn't just the betrayal of the filing that stung Charles. It was the idea that Harry had chosen to go through lawyers rather than come directly to him. That he'd rather drag a sacred and painful doubt into a courtroom than into a private conversation. To Charles, it felt like an execution without a trial. The king didn't sleep that night. The next morning, his staff noticed that his usual breakfast tray had been untouched. His dogs were walked by someone else. A royal equerry noted that he canceled his early morning ride, something he almost never did, not even in the rain. The palace tried to maintain routine, but everyone sensed the mood had shifted. It wasn't a diplomatic crisis. It was a family implosion dressed in royal garments. Behind closed doors, Charles met with his most trusted confidants. One of them was Sir Clive Alderton, his principal private secretary, who had served him since the Prince of Wales years. According to sources close to the palace, the conversation was unlike any they'd had before. Charles wasn't asking for strategy or damage control. He was asking if it was possible that Harry truly believed he wasn't his son. Sir Clive, a man known for discretion and loyalty, reportedly answered, "No, sir. But belief is sometimes more dangerous than fact." The king then asked a question that caught everyone off guard. "Should I take the test?" This question froze the room. The idea of the King of England submitting to a paternity test, not for public record, not for science, but for private pain, was beyond protocol. But in that moment, Charles wasn't trying to defend his throne. He was grasping for clarity, for some way to understand why the son he once held so close now believed they were strangers in blood. Ultimately, he didn't take the test. But the question itself marked a breaking point. It signaled that this wasn't just political fallout, it was emotional devastation. Those close to Charles began to notice subtle changes in his behavior. His temper, once tightly restrained, began to flare more easily behind palace walls. Aides described moments of uncharacteristic outbursts, slamming doors, abrupt silences, sudden changes in tone. In a private conversation with Queen Camilla, overheard by a senior servant, Charles allegedly said, "If he doesn't believe he's my son, then let him be what he wants, an orphan." Whether said in rage or heartbreak, the line echoed throughout the palace. An orphan. It was the kind of phrase that revealed how deeply Charles felt abandoned, rejected, and betrayed. He began to withdraw from some of his usual engagements. Though he still performed public duties with practiced poise, insiders noted his gaze was often distant, his attention divided. During a meeting with Commonwealth leaders, he reportedly misread briefing notes, prompting aides to step in and clarify points he would typically recite from memory. The usually composed monarch was now distracted, haunted, perhaps, by the idea that no matter how many castles he occupied, one part of his kingdom had collapsed forever. Behind the scenes, Charles also began questioning his own legacy. If Harry, once the spare, had gone this far, what did that mean for the future of the monarchy? Could trust be rebuilt? Was William now the only hope? More importantly, would the public ever view the monarchy the same way again? For Charles, the decision that lay ahead wasn't just about discipline, it was about survival. And that's where the emotional gave way to the institutional. In a private session with the Lord Chancellor and key legal advisors, Charles was briefed on all ramifications of the court filing. They discussed precedents, potential leaks, media implications, and how to prevent this from escalating further. One lawyer reportedly warned, if you acknowledge the request, even privately, you legitimize it. If you deny it, you fuel speculation. But if you act decisively, you control the narrative. That was the moment the emotional trauma turned into a constitutional crisis. And Charles, despite the heartbreak, decided to act. But even as he moved toward the idea of disowning Harry formally, stripping him of ceremonial roles, cutting him off from trusts, and removing his standing from any future succession planning, he did so not with vengeance, but with a quiet, tortured resolve. He knew it would hurt more than it would heal, but he believed it would also protect the institution that had been handed down to him, battered but intact. And perhaps, at some level, he hoped the act would force Harry to confront what he had done. Charles did not gloat. He did not leak his intentions to the press. Instead, he instructed his private legal team to begin drafting a decree that would remove Harry's remaining privileges. When asked how he wanted the decree worded, Charles reportedly said, "As if he never asked, as if he never doubted me, but as if he never returned." It was a sentence filled with contradiction, resentment cloaked in sadness, fatherly love shrouded in royal authority. In the days that followed, Charles returned to his public duties. At a garden party for war veterans, he smiled, shook hands, and even shared light jokes. But those closest to him said his eyes no longer sparkled with the warmth they once held. When asked by one elderly veteran about how his family was doing, Charles reportedly paused for a moment too long and then responded, "Family is complicated, isn't it?" Back at the palace, the emotional toll continued. Friends of Camilla noted that she had become more protective, more vocal in private. Though she had always maintained a cautious stance when it came to Harry, she now became more firm in her opinions. She allegedly told one confidant, "He's done irreparable damage, and Charles doesn't see the full scale of it yet." William, meanwhile, took on a more commanding role. He began quietly absorbing some of the responsibilities Charles could no longer face with the same vigor. Meetings with advisors, discussions on royal communications, even international protocol. William's presence became more visible, more strategic. Though he too was hurting, his response was pragmatic. "There's a throne to protect," he reportedly told one palace aide, "even if it means cutting ties." For Charles, that sentiment was both comforting and painful. One son stepping up while the other steps away. One fulfilling duty while the other questions identity. As the days turned into weeks, Charles began to speak less about Harry. Those close to him said it was as though Harry had become a ghost, present in memory but never mentioned aloud. Yet the weight never left him. At state dinners, he was often observed touching his ring, a subtle, nervous gesture he'd never displayed before. In moments of solitude, his staff reported seeing him standing by the window of his study, gazing out over the palace gardens, lost in thought. This was not just about a court filing. This was about the slow, agonizing realization that something sacred had been broken. That love, when tangled in power, protocol, and lineage, can sometimes unravel beyond repair. And for King Charles, the pain of that unraveling wasn't just personal, it was existential. Because no matter what titles one holds, no matter how many crowns rest upon one's head, the ache of a child who no longer calls you father is the kind of sorrow no decree can erase. In every scandal that has rocked the modern British monarchy, Meghan Markle's name has surfaced like a spark on dry grass, fast to ignite, polarizing in perception, and nearly impossible to extinguish. Since the moment she entered the royal stage, Meghan has been both venerated and vilified, depending on whom you ask. But when Prince Harry's request for a paternity verification made its way into legal filings and headlines, a new wave of scrutiny surged in her direction. Not because she signed the documents, not because her name appeared in the court records, it didn't, but because the public, the press, and even some within palace walls believed she had, in one way or another, orchestrated the entire ordeal. To many insiders, the filing didn't feel like something Harry would do alone. Not in the way it was phrased, not with the timing so tightly aligned with their escalating financial stress, and certainly not with the cold precision it seemed to convey. The language was measured, strategic, almost devoid of personal emotion. And that, observers noted, felt more like Meghan's signature than Harry's. Even before the filing, Meghan had often been described as the architect behind many of the couple's most consequential decisions. Their withdrawal from royal duties, their televised interview with Oprah Winfrey, their commercial partnerships with streaming giants and publishing houses, all were said to carry Meghan's imprint in tone, timing, or ambition. Whether that's fair or not remains debatable, but within the royal apparatus, the belief runs deep that Meghan is rarely passive. The days following the leak of the court filing reignited that belief with a vengeance. Aides and former palace staff began speaking, some anonymously, others more openly. One former communications officer at Kensington Palace told a respected UK journalist, "Harry might have signed the papers, but the tone, the calculation, the legal mechanics, those feel very much like Meghan's world." Another former aide added, "There's a difference between acting on emotion and executing a plan. This filing was a plan." What, then, would Meghan's motive have been? For some, the answer lies in finance. At the time of the legal filing, the couple's lucrative media deals were beginning to fray. Their Spotify partnership had ended prematurely. Netflix, though still honoring contracts, was rumored to be cooling its interest in Sussex-related content due to waning audience engagement. Their brand, once a global phenomenon of independence and reinvention, was starting to encounter real challenges. Public sympathy had begun to shift. Stories painting them as victims of the royal machine were giving way to critiques portraying them as opportunists exploiting royal drama for profit. In this context, the court filing can be seen as a reset button, a way to shake the narrative loose, regain control of the headlines, and potentially create leverage within legal structures related to inheritance. If Meghan saw royal coffers as locked behind bureaucracy and distrust, then challenging Harry's paternity may have been, in her view, a legal and financial provocation. A checkmate move in a high-stakes game she felt was rigged against them. Others see a deeper, more psychological motive. Meghan's history with strained family dynamics is no secret. Her public falling out with her father, Thomas Markle, played out in a painfully messy spectacle, with dueling media interviews and tabloid feuds. That pattern, one where personal grievance intersects with public consequence, seemed to repeat when she joined the royal family. If she felt slighted, ignored, or insulted, she responded not with silence but with strategy. The legal route was not unfamiliar to her. From privacy lawsuits to copyright disputes, Meghan had shown a consistent readiness to fight back, not just emotionally but legally. In the context of the court filing, some theorize that Meghan may have seen the request for a paternity test not as betrayal, but as emancipation. If Harry questioned his roots, if the palace had, in her eyes, always treated him as secondary, then why not bring those suspicions into the open? Why not challenge the institution at its most sacred point, its bloodline? To be clear, no document has emerged proving Meghan pushed Harry to file the request. There are no recordings, no email trails, no signed directives. But the timing of the move, the legal framing of the argument, and the language used bear a striking resemblance to the tactics employed in previous legal disputes Meghan had championed or personally driven. Former members of the couple's legal team, though bound by confidentiality, reportedly spoke off the record to journalists from multiple outlets. One claimed she didn't write the request, but she was involved. She reviewed the language. She understood the implications. Another said, "Let's just say Harry's instincts don't usually run to courtroom litigation. That's not his style." But once it becomes about leverage, that's when Meghan steps in. In Montecito, neighbors and friends of the couple began noticing subtle shifts in their routine following the filing. Harry, usually more present in social events and public-facing activities, had become more reclusive. Meghan, on the other hand, was seen attending more meetings alone, dining with legal counsel, and taking longer than usual phone calls behind closed doors. According to a member of their extended professional team, she was in control. Whatever was happening, she wasn't shaken. She was focused. Meanwhile, palace insiders began circulating a theory that sent shockwaves through the inner royal circle. The theory suggested that Meghan had long encouraged Harry to explore the rumors about James Hewitt, not because she believed them, but because the very act of questioning gave them power. In their strategy, doubt was a weapon. If Harry could be portrayed as potentially outside the bloodline, then every institution that had rejected or sidelined them could be challenged. Why weren't they treated equally? Why weren't their children offered the same privileges? If Harry's place in the royal lineage was uncertain, then everything could be renegotiated, from inheritance rights to the treatment of Archie and Lilibet. It was, in some circles, viewed as weaponizing uncertainty. Yet not everyone saw Meghan's alleged role as malicious. Some commentators argued that Meghan was doing what any wife might do for a husband in pain, encouraging him to seek truth, even if that truth was difficult. American talk show host Gayle King, a friend of the couple, hinted in a segment that Meghan's strength had always been her belief in transparency. "Meghan doesn't believe in silence when injustice is involved," King said. "If she stood by Harry during this, that's not manipulation. That's partnership." Still, the court of public opinion has not been kind. Meghan's name trended across social media alongside words like traitor, instigator, and puppeteer. Hashtags questioning her influence exploded. Online forums speculated that she had crafted the entire legal drama to further isolate Harry from his family, positioning herself and their children as his only remaining anchor. In response, her defenders rallied, painting her as a scapegoat for a deeply broken royal institution unwilling to face its own flaws. Inside the palace, however, there was no such debate. The belief was near universal: Meghan had gone too far. Though Charles refrained from public comment, sources close to him said that in private, he referred to the filing as a foreign invasion, a clear signal that he viewed Meghan as the outsider who had pushed his son over a cliff. Prince William was reportedly even harsher. One aide described his anger not just as brotherly disappointment, but as protective rage. William believed the filing crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Not only had it torn the family apart, but it had also desecrated their mother's memory. In his view, Diana had protected her sons from the scandal surrounding Hewitt. For Harry to now weaponize that very scandal, possibly at Meghan's urging, was more than betrayal, it was desecration. Publicly, Meghan remained silent. No statement was issued. No interview was given. But sources suggest her silence was strategic. She knew anything she said could be used against her, twisted, or leaked. Instead, she focused on controlling what could be controlled. Her image, her children's environment, and her next moves. But behind closed doors, things were reportedly different. According to one Montecito staff member, Meghan was not without emotion. She cried after reading the reaction in the British press. Not for herself, but for what it was doing to Harry. She allegedly said, "They'll never forgive him. Not for this. And it's my fault he had the courage to do it." That line, if true, sums up Meghan's alleged role in the saga, not just as a strategist, not just as an advisor, but as a mirror. A reflection of the parts of Harry that dared to question, dared to fight, and dared to let the pain surface after years of burying it under royal decorum. Whether she pushed him or supported him, whether she orchestrated the move or merely stood by it, Meghan was at the center. Not in name, not in paper, but in presence. And in a family built on lineage, tradition, and silence, her presence was always going to be a disruption. The question now is, did Meghan open the door to truth, or did she knock down the last bridge between father and son? Either way, the damage is done. The consequences are playing out. And the royal family, once a fortress of tradition, is now a battlefield of emotion, law, and legacy. There are moments in royal history when the future of a dynasty hinges not on pomp and ceremony, but on quiet conversations behind closed doors. One such conversation took place between King Charles and Prince William in the early hours of a cold, overcast morning inside Windsor Castle. No photographers, no press releases, no documentation beyond the sealed memories of those in the room. Just a father and a son, two men, both inheritors of a complicated legacy facing the ugliest crossroads of their lineage. By the time William arrived at the castle, the tension surrounding Harry's court filing had reached a boiling point. King Charles had not yet made his final decision on how to respond, though the emotional wreckage was already visible in his appearance, in his retreat from public duties, and in the way he had begun snapping at advisors who once enjoyed his confidence. The king had become increasingly erratic, not in policy but in presence. It was clear to all those around him that the emotional toll of Harry's betrayal was making its way into every facet of his leadership. The monarchy, while still outwardly stable, was internally shaken. William, unlike his father, responded to the crisis with a sense of cold purpose. The emotional devastation he felt over Harry's actions was buried beneath layers of responsibility. In public, he carried on with appearances, handshakes, and charity events. In private, he was livid. Palace aides described him as stone-faced and absolutely gutted, but also frighteningly resolute. He had always been the more duty-bound of the two brothers. Where Harry rebelled, William absorbed. And in this moment, with his brother threatening the monarchy from within, William knew it was time to act. The meeting had been arranged not by secretaries but through a simple, handwritten note delivered to Charles's desk the night before. "We need to talk. Not as royals. As family. Before it's too late." Signed simply, William. Charles agreed. The meeting took place in one of the king's private drawing rooms, heavily draped with royal blue curtains, the furniture unchanged since Queen Elizabeth's time. It was a room that had borne witness to countless royal decisions, most of them ceremonial. But this meeting was far from pageantry. This was about blood, legacy, betrayal, and the future of a 1,000-year-old institution. William entered the room wearing a dark overcoat, removed it without ceremony, and sat down before his father said a word. Charles stood by the fireplace, staring into the low, flickering flames, his back turned. For a moment, there was only silence. Then William spoke. "I know you're hurting," he began. "But this isn't about just you and Harry. This is about the crown, the country. We don't have the luxury of grief. Not anymore." Charles didn't respond immediately. When he turned around, his eyes were bloodshot. Not from tears, but from exhaustion. The weight of the betrayal was written in every line on his face. But there was also something else, something William hadn't seen in a long time. Doubt. Charles walked slowly to his side table, poured 2 drinks, one for himself, one for William, and sat across from his son. "He's my son," the king said finally. "I held him in my arms when he was born. I watched him grow. I listened to him cry for his mother. And now he wants proof. As if a courtroom can measure love." William looked at his father, the drink untouched. "This isn't about love anymore. He's opened a door we can't close. And you know it." Charles's voice cracked slightly. "I keep thinking, what if he really believes it? What if, deep down, he's convinced himself of this lie? What does that make me? What does it make our history?" William leaned forward. "It doesn't matter what he believes. What matters is what the world now believes. You have a duty, father, not just to him, to the crown, to the people. If we allow this to stand, unchecked, then everything unravels. Everything." The king ran a hand through his hair, clearly tormented. "Would you disown your own son, William?" he asked quietly. "Could you look George in the eye and say you are no longer my child?" William didn't hesitate. "If George publicly questioned whether I was his father, filed a court request to prove it, then yes, I would. Because the role we hold is not personal. It is sovereign. And the moment Harry made it public, he stopped being your son in private. He became a threat in public." It was a chilling statement, one that marked a decisive shift in William's role. No longer just the heir, he had stepped into the mindset of a monarch in training. The family drama, to him, was secondary to the preservation of the institution. The conversation turned then, away from emotion and into planning. William presented a list of proposed actions, reportedly drafted with assistance from his private legal advisors and senior courtiers. It included the following recommendations: immediate revocation of Harry's remaining ceremonial roles and honorary military titles. A royal decree to exclude him from any succession-related discussions or obligations. A private but legally binding freeze on all trust distributions connected to the Crown Estate or Duchy of Cornwall. Internal communication strategy to shift public focus toward the duties and stability of the Prince and Princess of Wales. Charles listened, eyes cast down. Every recommendation felt like a knife. But the logic was unassailable. The monarchy had survived centuries of war, scandal, abdications, and revolutions. It could not, under his watch, collapse under the weight of one man's doubt. There was one more item William proposed, perhaps the most brutal of all, an internal family edict that until Harry formally withdrew his legal request and issued a public statement of apology, no member of the royal family would communicate with him directly. In short, total excommunication. Charles flinched at that. "He's still your brother," the king said. "Your mother would have wanted." William cut him off, not with anger, but with finality. "Mother would have wanted him to act with dignity. She protected us from that rumor her entire life. And now he's dragging her into the mud with this. Do not speak of her wishes when he's the one desecrating them." The room fell silent again. In that silence, something unspoken passed between them. A surrender, perhaps. Or an understanding that the roles they played now required the sacrifice of sentiment. Charles finally nodded. "Draft the decree," he said. "Make it private. Make it final." The meeting ended without a hug, without reassurances. It ended as royal decisions often do, with nods, signatures, and the quiet, heavy sound of a door closing. But the ripples from that meeting spread far beyond Windsor. Within days, Harry's access to several royal properties was quietly revoked. His scheduled attendance at a Commonwealth charity gala was cancelled, citing logistical conflicts. Trust funds once allocated for the Sussex estate went into legal stasis. The royal press office refused to comment on any questions involving Harry's legal filing, offering only the now infamous line, "We do not comment on family matters." But for those in the know, the message was clear. William had taken the reins. Charles had handed him the future. And Harry, for all his titles and past glories, was now officially outside the gates. In retrospect, that meeting between father and son was more than a consultation. It was a symbolic passing of the torch. Charles, overwhelmed and emotionally wounded, turned to the one person he knew could lead without cracking. And William, battle-hardened by years of media attacks, betrayal, and familial division, stood up not just as a son but as a sovereign-to-be. And while the world would continue to ask questions about Harry's identity, about Meghan's influence, about Charles's heartache, one thing was now undeniable. The future of the monarchy belonged to William. In the long, meticulously documented history of the British monarchy, there are few moments as rare or as severe as the drafting of a royal decree against a bloodborne prince. Yet, Following Prince Harry's explosive legal request for a paternity test, which struck at the very heart of monarchy itself, King Charles authorized an extraordinary action, one that would forever alter the shape of the royal family and send an unmistakable message to the world. There are lines even blood cannot cross. The decision did not come lightly, nor quickly. It came after weeks of agonized deliberation, emotional turmoil, and growing constitutional concern. But when the final moment arrived, it was executed with cold, clinical precision. The royal decree, hand-drafted under the guidance of the Lord Chancellor, the King's private council, and several constitutional experts, was written in the ancient language of sovereign authority, but its meaning was brutally clear. Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, though never stripped of the title by Act of Parliament, was to be functionally erased from the institutional body of the monarchy. The decree was not broadcast to the public. There were no trumpets, no ceremonial announcements. It was signed, stamped with the royal seal, and filed into the vaults of royal protocol with quiet finality. Yet its contents would soon leak, first in whispers through palace corridors, then through a tightly managed network of off-the-record sources, until reporters across Britain confirmed the details. According to those familiar with the document, the decree covered three main areas: succession exclusion, ceremonial exclusion, and financial exclusion. Succession exclusion was the most symbolic. Though Harry remained, by law, in the line of succession to the British throne, the King's decree ensured that in practice, he would be excluded from any and all internal royal discussions regarding future leadership, regency planning, or constitutional succession matters. No correspondence, briefings, or discussions about the monarchy's direction were to be shared with him under any circumstance. The message was simple: Harry may remain on paper, but he is no longer part of the monarchy's future. Ceremonial exclusion, however, was more immediate and more visible. Harry would no longer be invited to attend state occasions, including Remembrance Day events, Commonwealth ceremonies, royal jubilees, or official family gatherings that involved sovereign representation. Military events, where Harry once wore his blues and royals uniform with pride, were off-limits. His honorary military titles, long a point of contention, were reaffirmed as permanently revoked. A palace memo, circulated quietly among event planners and officials, instructed all departments to omit the Duke of Sussex from future ceremonial planning indefinitely. Financial exclusion was, perhaps, the most painful cut of all. The decree stipulated that Harry was no longer eligible to receive distributions from any private royal trusts managed by the Crown Estate, Duchy of Lancaster, or Duchy of Cornwall. Though some funds had already been restricted following his and Meghan's exit from senior royal duties in 2020, this new measure was absolute. A full audit of prior disbursements was ordered. All ongoing payouts were to be ceased. Legal arrangements were made to inform banks, trustees, and legal representatives. The instruction from the king was final: Harry would not receive another penny from the House of Windsor. To those inside the monarchy, this decree was devastating in its implications. Never before had such a comprehensive disownment been delivered without parliamentary involvement or a formal abdication. It was, in essence, a royal exile, silent but suffocating. No castles, no offices, no ceremonial duties, no family briefings, no money. The only thing Harry retained was his name and his place in the royal birth register, a technicality, nothing more. Those closest to Charles said the decision changed him. While the king maintained public appearances with his usual grace and polish, there was a hollowness behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. He had made a choice not just as a monarch, but as a father. And even though he believed it was the right choice, it carved something out of him that could not be restored. One aide recalled seeing Charles after the decree was signed. He stood by a window overlooking the palace gardens, holding the pen he had used. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood there, as if waiting for something to come back that never would. For Prince William, the decree brought a grim sense of necessity fulfilled. He had advocated for decisive action. He had helped write the policy that would protect the crown. But when the paper was signed, when the letter was delivered, even he felt the weight of what had just been done. According to a source close to him, William later confided to Catherine, it was like cutting off a limb. But it had to be done. The royal family prepared for the inevitable leak to the press. It came, as predicted, through an anonymous source within the legal community. Within days, reputable outlets began reporting the story. Headlines screamed across the front pages. Harry disowned by king, royal decree shocks nation, Charles cuts ties with son over paternity claim. Public reaction was mixed. Among traditional royalists, the move was met with a measure of approval. Editorials praised Charles for defending the monarchy from internal destabilization. The crown must prevail, read one leading conservative paper. No man is bigger than the monarchy. Others were far less forgiving. Progressive commentators, especially in the U.S., condemned the act as brutal, medieval, and emotionally callous. Talk shows and social media platforms erupted with debate. Had Charles gone too far? Was this the moment the monarchy lost its moral high ground? In California, the news hit Harry with the force of a tidal wave. Though he had reportedly anticipated some form of retaliation, the full scope of the disownment stunned even him. According to sources close to the Sussex household, Harry had believed the matter might be handled quietly, perhaps a personal rebuke, maybe a legal rejection of the filing. But a full royal decree? That was nuclear. One of Harry's close friends, speaking anonymously, said he didn't expect forgiveness. But he never thought his father would pull the trigger on a document like that. It shattered him. Eyewitnesses reported that Harry retreated into seclusion for days. He canceled scheduled meetings, missed virtual conferences, and stopped answering calls. One staff member described him walking through the estate's garden with a vacant expression, pausing occasionally to sit in silence under a tree. Meghan reportedly kept the children away during the worst of it, giving him space to process what had happened. Behind the scenes, legal teams began scrambling. Though the royal decree had no effect on Harry's American ventures, it would impact his visibility, his status in future documentaries, his leverage in negotiations. More urgently, the freezing of funds placed additional pressure on the couple's dwindling finances. The illusion of Sussex independence had always been partially subsidized by legacy wealth. Now that stream was permanently cut off. For Meghan, the reaction was equally complex. Publicly, she remained silent. Privately, she was said to be furious. Not because of the financial consequences, though those were real, but because she saw the act as proof of what she'd long claimed, that the royal family would discard anyone who challenged their authority, no matter how close the bloodline. In one unconfirmed but widely circulated rumor, Meghan allegedly told a friend they've made him an orphan again. First they took his mother. Now they've taken his father. Whether the quote is accurate or not, it captured the emotional undercurrent many felt watching the drama unfold. A family once held together by duty and tradition was now splintered beyond recognition. The official palace response to media inquiries was clinical and brief. We do not comment on private family legal matters. But everyone knew this was not just a private matter. It was the most public unraveling of a royal relationship since the abdication of King Edward VIII. And unlike that historic crisis, there was no foreign divorcee to blame. Only a son, a father, and a question that should never have been asked. In the weeks that followed, efforts were made to solidify the boundaries. Harry's name was removed from internal royal correspondence lists. Invitations to diplomatic events stopped arriving. Commonwealth ambassadors were quietly informed that Harry and Meghan were no longer to be considered representatives of the crown in any capacity. Several charities that had previously listed Harry as a royal patron were advised to update their websites and marketing materials. It was a full institutional purge, meticulously executed. And while no official statement said so, the message was clear. Harry was no longer part of the family business. For the monarchy, the decree was meant to restore stability. But for the British public, and indeed, the world, it marked a turning point. Never before had a royal family, already battered by scandal, death, and global criticism, taken such a visible, irreversible step against one of its own. And in doing so, it revealed something raw and deeply human behind the pageantry and protocol. Even kings can break. Even fathers can choose duty over blood. Even a royal family, bound by centuries of tradition, can become a battlefield of betrayal, silence, and irreversible decisions. The decree was the final word on Harry's place in the institution. But its echoes are still ringing, not just through palaces and courtrooms, but through the hearts of a country now watching a family torn apart by a question no crown can answer.